The good, the bad, and the ugly. I think I can guess which Fred would have said I was, but Fred was very fond of westerns. His favourite was the 1953 film Shane. I don't know how many of you have seen that film. I remember Fred pointing out to me one time when we were watching it that what appears now to be all cliches in that film weren't when it was actually being made. At that point, they weren't cliches yet. They became cliches perhaps after that particular movie. So, we're here to celebrate Fred. I mean, despite all his amazing achievements that you're going to hear a lot more about in a few moments, Fred was actually a very humble and a modest person. I was actually with Fred in the mathematics department when it became public that he was no longer just Dr. Piper, but Professor Piper. He was obviously pleased, but in typical Fred fashion, he totally played it down. There were no airs and graces with Fred. He was simply a very gentle, kind, and a totally unselfish person. Today really should not be a sad occasion. It shouldn't be somber, it shouldn't be sad. Yeah, we all miss Fred, of course we do, but today is a celebration of what was a remarkable man. And because this man affected so many lives throughout the world, and he lives on within us, not just in this room, but all over the world, there are lives that Fred touched. I imagine most people in this room have their own memories of Fred and the way he affected their lives. While we live on, so does Fred, is within us all. My name is Henry Becker. I was originally a student of Fred's back in the early 70s, and while I was doing my PhD, would meet regularly. This was often in a betting shop. I did actually learn a lot about horse racing while I was doing my PhD. And then, because I was rather busy at the time with my building and decorating business, which was paying my way through university and all the rest of it, in order to get time to get together to discuss mathematics, it kind of became a problem. But Professor F.C. Piper came up with a solution. One summer, he came to work for me as a builder's mate. He did draw the line at my singing, that he would not tolerate. But other than that, it worked reasonably well. In the late 70s, I got a job with a large electronics company. And by the way, Fred had a hand in that as well, but that's another story. And I started to learn about cryptography. And at that time, there were no published books or papers other than things on the history of cryptography. So I really had to start from scratch. And Fred also got interested in the subject, and so we began working together. Well, continued working together would be more accurate. You see, Fred loved his students, and the relationship with his students rarely ended when they finished their PhD. Fred was sufficiently confident that he didn't feel the need to lead students. He was very happy to be led by them. So he was very happy to let you get involved in whatever you wanted to get involved with, and then he was happy to learn about it and kind of join in and so on. So as I say, we worked together on cryptography and information security and continued doing so for the next 2 decades, through the 80s and 90s. Put simply, Fred became my best friend, the best friend I've ever had, and a friendship that lasted for more than 50 years. So, as you're going to hear, Fred was a brilliant mathematician and a wonderful, unselfish teacher. But he was also a very, very humble and kind and loving family man. And that's a perfect time for me to introduce Joanna, Fred's daughter.
Thank you, Henry. So there are so many stories that epitomise Fred, and I've been making sure that I tell them to my kids repeatedly to make sure that they have a sense of him beyond the illness that stopped his last few years being a proper representation of who and what he was, because he was truly one of a kind. He was Fred to everybody, including my brother and I, which led many to assume he was our stepdad. Even when Fred was at school, where everybody was known by their surnames, he was Fred. Indeed, only his grandkids got away with deciding what they would get to call him. He was holey jumpers and polo shirts. With one side of the collar tucked in, which I'm glad to see is the picture we've got to our left. In fact, I'd only seen him in a suit in photos from his and Mum's wedding until I was 16 when the ISG received the Queen's Award, and he had no excuse at that point. When he discovered that batik shirts were considered formal dress on his trips to Malaysia, he quickly adopted their approach to formality and stocked up. My favourite quote that I've come across to describe him was in an article in the Times many years ago, when he was described as looking like a reject roadie for Status Quo. And that will always make me smile. To my son Dylan, he was famous, because if you Google Fred Piper, he's the first result that appears. He even did a biography of him for school homework when he was asked to write about a famous person. Most people did footballers, singers, movie stars. Dylan chose Fred. He's also sneaky and repeated that a couple of times when he had to do things about famous mathematicians later. Always helps when you've got it pre-written. Fred would break every rule in the book, as long as it wasn't a speed limit. He'd pay no attention to dress codes. When he was in boarding school, he worked out how to cheat the train tickets so that he could go home at the weekend. Only Fred would get caught by one of his teachers and managed to get away with it by showing the teacher how to fake the tickets too. I think we're safe sharing that one now the statute of limitations is well and truly passed. When my parents lived in America soon after they got married, Fred happily stood back and giggled as Mum got questioned by the police in Chicago because her skirt was a bit short for America in the mid-60s. But I can only imagine his reaction when he nearly got arrested in Kuwait in the late 90s because he'd been given out-of-date currency. He always encouraged us to do what we enjoyed. When I was choosing my degree subject, I actively avoided doing maths so that I wasn't always going to be Professor Piper's daughter. But there was no escape, even opting to study Italian. When I arrived at university in Rome for a year abroad, I walked in with Mum to get the paperwork done on day one, to suddenly hear an excited voice calling Mum's name. Sure enough, the exchange scheme was actually run by one of Dan Hughes' ex-students. Well, when she realised I was the reason that Fred was coming to lecture for her, it's safe to say that from then on, I could do no wrong. Fred was a continual joker and a constant tease, to the point that when I was born and he told his mum that her 6th grandchild was a girl, the first granddaughter, she simply didn't believe him. I think it's safe to say I'm not telling anybody in this room something new when I say that Fred was an incredible teacher. He coached Mum through passing her O-level maths after more than one attempt. He helped me achieve my AS further maths when the teachers at school couldn't get any of it to sink into my mind. He tutored one of Sam's friends for maths GCSE, and not only did the friend pass when he'd been finding it hard, but he showed him the difference a good teacher could make. And he went on to become a maths teacher. I remember Fred coming into my junior school to teach us about ciphers, and many of my friends still talk about that to this day. In fact, we've still got some of the wheels that he used, and that's another one that my son has tucked away. There are so many wonderful memories that have been running through my head over the past few months, but it's some of the simplest things that will endure. Watching Shane repeatedly, every time it was on. Saturday afternoons on the sofa, watching the A-Team or Knight Rider, well, at least until Grandstand started. The same record on repeat for hours while he was working, and it only being changed after weeks when one of us had had enough and sneak into his study because we needed to listen to something different. Sunday morning swimming before we went to see Fred's mum, and only finding out as an adult that he actually didn't really like swimming. Finding the remote control for the TV in the fridge because it was never left unguarded, but Fred was easily distracted by a snack. And it's those simple moments that I will certainly miss the most. Thank you.
Superb. I love that one that's on the back of the service. Just beautiful. The two of them not looking at each other at all. It's just fabulous. Fred very much enjoyed Paul Simon, and he loved the Graceland album. But it does actually feel like the title of this song, I Know What I Know, would make a great epitaph for Fred. He was very much his own man. And yeah. Chris Mitchell, I'd like to introduce next. Chris was a PhD student of Fred's between 75 and 79. And after a spell in industry with Rakel and Hewlett-Packard, he rejoined Fred here at Royal Holloway in 1990, where he remains today. Chris has served as director of the Information Security Group. And over to you, Chris.
Fred studied for his BSc and PhD at Imperial College before taking up a lectureship at Royal Holloway in the mid-1960s. He then moved on to Westfield College, University of London, in the late 60s. Westfield was where I first met him. I was a first-year undergraduate in his algebra lectures, starting in October 1972, by which time he was already a reader in mathematics. His wonderfully clear and inspiring lectures made an enduring impression on all those of us fortunate to be there. After gaining my first degree in 1975, I was fortunate enough to stay on at Westfield to complete my PhD under his supervision. He was a wonderful supervisor as well as teacher, giving me just the right encouragement and support. At Westfield, Fred joined the late Dan Hughes, and they together formed a formidable research partnership enduring through the 1970s and beyond. With the end of science teaching at Westfield, Fred moved back to Royal Holloway in the mid-1980s and developed a research group in cryptography, working closely with Peter Wilde. This group expanded to cover computer science-focused topics in the early 1990s and enabled the college to launch an MSc in Information Security in 1992. Fred was clearly the leading and inspirational figure in developing the degree, as well as what became the Information Security Group. Over the subsequent years, Fred's own interests broadened to cover not only cryptography, but also the broader industry and commerce-focused subject of information security, where he became a champion of early attempts to develop the security profession through his work with the IISP. Of course, volumes could be written about Fred's influence on the development of the ISG at Royal Holloway over 30 years, as well as the practice of information security in the wider world. Suffice it to say that Fred was the key figure, not only for his long spell as ISG director, but also subsequently when he was a hugely important source of wisdom and guidance to his successors in the role. Fred cared deeply about the ISG, which of course today is an academic department in its own right. And the ongoing success of the department is a testament to Fred's dedication and energy. Fred looked after and cared deeply about his PhD children, and he was always keen to stay in contact and continue to work with his ex-students. Fred was the subject of many awards, too many to mention now. Above all else, I think Fred would be happiest with the knowledge that through his teaching, wise counsel, and encouragement, he personally touched and improved the lives of so many people. Although he would no doubt squirm to read this praise, as he always sought to avoid the limelight. I couldn't have achieved half of what I've done over the last 50 years without Fred's guidance and friendship. And I know the same is true for so many of us. Thank you, Fred. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I remember in Fred's study, he had lined up all the sort of PhD theses from his students. And last time I was over there, I did actually count them up. I think there were 57. I don't know whether they were all there or whether there were more students, but I was one of his students. Chris was one of his students. Peter Wilde was one of his students. I know scattered around the room there are a few more of his students here. It really is an incredible achievement. That many PhD students, as Chris said, the number of people he influenced is just enormous. Our next speaker, Peter Wilde, also, as I say, started out as a student of Fred's at Westfield College, and then he became a colleague of Fred's at Royal Holloway, and again, Peter ended up as a director of the Information Security Group. Unfortunately, Peter this morning got in touch to say he's got COVID. So he can't be with us today. There's a lot of it going around at the moment, I'm afraid. But Chris kindly offered, if you're ready for it, to read Peter's script for him and on behalf. Thanks, Chris.
Thanks, Ed. So this is what Peter sent me a few days ago, just to read through, to check that we didn't overlap too much in what we were going to say. We do overlap, but students were a very important part of Fred's career. Whether teaching maths to 12-year-olds on Saturday morning classes, or inspiring undergraduates by turning them on to the joys of algebra, or supervising postgraduates in how to do original research, or providing MSc students with understanding and skills to develop a career in information security. Fred was a natural communicator. Perhaps not all of you know that at school, Fred taught England cricketer John Snow how to bowl, or at least that's what he always said. When I read this, by the way, I said to Peter, you should have added something to say that Peter would have been very happy if he hadn't done that as an Australian. Fred had an extremely quick mind and a tremendous grasp of his subject, but it was the relationship he had with his students that made him exceptional. Students were in awe of his relaxed style of lecturing. For example, when giving a first-year algebra lecture, lecturing, as always, without notes, Fred stopped one day, took out of his pocket of his corduroy trousers and pulled out a scrap of paper. He looked at it, returned it to his pocket, and then went on to give an example which illustrated the theory just covered. Fred's personality and rapport with students extended beyond the classroom. He enjoyed socialising with students and they with him. He was always one of the first on the dance floor at Math Society dinners and went on to math student trips, staying at University of London Mountain Club huts while walking in Wales, drinking Britvic Orange at the pub while the students downed pints. He was an enthusiastic, energetic and accomplished participant at staff versus student sports afternoons, often getting the better of the students. The supervision of PhD students has a special place in Fred's life, beginning with supervising Mick Ganley and Mike Walker when still a very young, newly appointed lecturer at Royal Holloway, followed by the group he and Dan Hughes had at the internationally renowned Centre in Finite Geometry and Combinatorics at Westfield College, and then a procession of dozens of research students in cryptography and broader topics within information security at Royal Holloway. He was our mentor and friend. Fred's informality and engagement, and the engagement he engendered in his students, is an important ingredient in the success of the MSc in Information Security. He made cryptography and security management accessible to students of all backgrounds. More than this, he was welcoming to all students, interested in where they came from, what their background was, and why they were pursuing the course. Fred was a catalyst at social events organised for the students to get to know each other and the staff. And the students sought him out to glean his wisdom and learn from his advice. Fred always had time for students. How lucky we are to have known such a remarkable man.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, most of you probably know that Fred didn't drink alcohol. He always claimed the last drink he had was a whiskey when I was celebrating having got my PhD. And we went out for a drink together and we went to the pub and he did actually have a whiskey that day and he claims that was the last one he ever had. I don't know. It's his claim. Our next tribute is coming from Norman Gower. Norman was principal of Royal Holloway from 1990 to 2000, and so he saw the beginnings of the Information Security Group and watched it grow, with Fred at the helm, from strength to strength over those years. Norman.
Although this is really a sad occasion, it is nevertheless a privilege to have this opportunity to take pleasure in remembering Fred, both for the individual that he was and the enormous contribution he gave to academic life and the example he set both to his students and all of us who had the good fortune to know him. There's a bit of overlap here, but I must just flip over his academic career. His academic career and his record has been excellently set out by Chris in his obituaries for the London Mathematical Society and the Institute of Maths. After his doctorate at Imperial, Fred joined Royal Holloway and then moved back to Westfield, first as reader and then professor. Everyone who taught him, as we've heard, remembers his inspirational teaching. His book on projective planes with Dan Hughes soon became the standard graduate. I know nothing. Okay, I'll try again. His book on projective planes with Dan Hughes, soon became the standard graduate text. When Fred moved back to Royal Holloway, he soon, with Henry, as we've heard, a former student who was working in industry with Racal, developed an interest in cryptography, and together they wrote Cipher Systems, which was a groundbreaking text. Soon, and influenced by Henry's work in industry, Fred's interests broadened into information security, and the rest is history and littered with prizes. The field is also rich with Fred's students, and this gave the group a distinctive flavour with its intimate relationships with industry. This not only shaped the group's approach to teaching, but influenced and informed his industrial partners. His impact has been enormous. But let me indulge in a few personal reflections. When I came to the college in 1990, the Information Security Group was gaining an international reputation, and in 1992 launched the first MSc in Information Security, the first in the country. At the time, the group was spread across mathematics and computer science, and this obviously was not satisfactory. It was very difficult to allocate teaching duties, policies on sabbaticals and so on, especially when you then had to teach a course which was split between two departments. As you might imagine, this was not an easy issue. It's what Sherlock Holmes might have regarded as a three-pipe problem. But in the end, it was all worked out with information security moving into maths and a boost given to computer science to develop their reputation in developing new statistical techniques to analyze big data or interrogate big data. Fortunately, it all worked out and no tempers were lost. Has anybody ever heard Fred lose his temper? So it's unimaginable. There are many reminiscences I could share with you, but one or two I think are characteristic. As many of you know, apart from all the work he did in the general academic life, he found time to give talks to schools particularly on cipher techniques. I remember him saying to me, the most secure way of passing a message is to put it in an envelope and give it to somebody. And this is how we always would start his talks to school, and then say, but suppose you can't actually see the person, you have to send it. And then he developed a little talk on the history of cipher systems, starting with the Romans and working right through. And of course, the kids were absolutely captivated, not just by the subject, but by Fred, obviously, himself. We can all remember Fred's sartorial taste, particularly the baggy jumper. Well, one of the many prizes that Fred and his group won was the Queen's Award for Industry. And to get this prize, Fred and I had to go to Buckingham Palace to get the award from the Queen. We were asked to take a few postgraduate students up with us at the same time. Anyway, the first thing that happened, Fred came to my office and he said, "Can I put a suit on expenses?" I was very tempted, but I didn't want to set a precedent, and so I said, "I'm sorry, Fred." And I did see him smile, so I think he got the expected answer. Anyway, we turned up at the palace in decent order, and we were stood there with the postgraduate students, I think 4 or 5, maybe 6 of them. Queen and Prince Philip came round, and Fred introduced, "This is so-and-so, he's from America, this is so-and-so, she's from Paris, so-and-so's from Australia," and so on. And the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh, they said, "We're very impressed that you can attract all these international students and we're training the world." And Fred said, "Yes, yes, yes." And they moved on, and I saw Fred suppressing a smile. So I said, what's up, Fred? He said, "Well, they're all spies." And he said, "If they're not yet, they soon will be." Anyway, going back to the baggy jumper, I can't remember who told me this story, whether it was Fred himself or somebody else, but he was giving a talk to the board of some big company. I can't remember the name of the company either, or I was never told it. Anyway, he was talking to the board in his baggy jumper, and they were all sitting there, and this stuffed shirt chairman said, "Oh, I don't know why we're hearing all this stuff. Our security systems are fantastic, nothing to worry about." So Fred fiddled around a bit, got his computer out, and he said, "Are these all your preferential discount rates?" So that shut them up neatly. I also remember Fred getting a big funding proposition from a mega company, and he came to talk to me about it, about what we should do. And the problem was that all the work that transpired with this project would be owned by the company, so it couldn't be published. And Fred was very concerned that this would inhibit the careers of the staff, especially the young staff. And so we agreed to turn it down. And this is absolutely typical of Fred, that he put particularly the young staff ahead of all other considerations. They were the days when young staff were looked after. Finally, I remember, I think this is typical of Fred as well. He came to see me one day and asked permission to take on some external work. He said, "I can't tell you who it's for, and I can't tell you what they're going to pay me." So I said, "That's fine, Fred," because knowing Fred's honesty and his principles, I knew that it was fine, and anyway, I guessed it was GCHQ. I'm sure this room is full of similar memories, but what we will all remember, most of all, is a man of extraordinary talent and vision, fondly remembered by his many students, a man whose integrity and modesty set the style for the group. It has been an enormous privilege to have been lucky enough to work with him. He's added to my life, and he's added to so many others, and he lives on in our memories with great fondness and the highest regard.
Knowing Fred, I'm surprised he didn't try and claim for the suit under industrial clothing or something. Actually, as Norman was talking there about the work he did with schools, he also did a huge amount of work with the Maths Olympiad. And, you know, as I say, he just touched so many lives in so many ways. Now, I remember all too well the politics behind getting the MSc and the ISG off the ground. And I'm sure there were many days when Norman was ready to tear his hair out, trying to get agreement between the different departments. But Norman, you're always incredibly supportive of what we were trying to do. And we thank you, because without your support, this might never have got off the ground in the first place. So, you know, that was a huge contribution that you made there as well. So thank you for that. We're now going to watch a short extract of Fred actually lecturing, and this was in 2011 at the MSc Information Security Study Workshop.
Before the jibes come in about the technology, I am going to use an overhead projector. I have been known to use PowerPoint, but I want to do this because, well, you'll see very quickly why. I want to be able to flip and change. My job is to create an atmosphere where you talk to each other. So you see the title, Information Security, what's it all about, and you might be tempted to think that that's what I'm going to attempt to answer. It's not. You're going to answer, I'm just going to listen, and maybe throw in the odd comment if and when it's appropriate. What we've got to remember is there are students here. How many of you have not even started the degree yet? So we've got to make sure that you just don't get swamped. So you've got to cry out. If people use words you don't know the meaning of, ask them and I will make sure they answer. This will shut them up from making them dominate. So what is it all about? Well, I'm not going to tell you. I'm hoping you're going to tell me. Let's talk about encryption, because I know encryption quite well. And there is no question at all that the use of encryption for confidentiality has always bothered governments. That's a statement I'm happy to defend, and I don't think any government would think. And if you look at government's policy on encryption, then crudely speaking, they want or are happy for the good guys, and good has to be in inverted commas because it's their definition of good, to be using encryption for everything that's good. They just don't want it used for bad purposes. The idea of good and bad is one thing subjective and also changes. Alliances between countries change over decades and so on. So here's a system. One of them implies that sometimes law enforcement wants to be on the horizontal line, and sometimes law enforcement wants to be on the vertical line. When you're on the horizontal line, you want your encryption to be unbreakable. When you're on the vertical line, you want to break the encryption being used. Brilliant though cryptographers may be, they can't invent an algorithm that's strong when the good guys use it and weak when the bad guys use it. So there's a dilemma here. You can't win on the vertical line and on the horizontal line. You can try, but you clearly can't. So the dilemma is, what do you do about encryption? Now, I'm not going to answer it, but there's the type of thing and the dilemma comes really because it's not clear who the good guys are and who the bad guys are in every situation. It is clear that many different countries, many different organizations are all using the same technology. And so the good guys and the bad guys share technology. They share technology, but they have different motives, different inventives. What the answer is, I don't know. Colin is about to come and rap me on the knuckles. So I think I'll stop. You disappointed me. I got to 4 slides instead of 2, which means you failed, ladies and gentlemen. But I guess I jumped it. Okay, thank you.
Our next 2 tributes will hopefully give at least a small feel for the impact that Fred had internationally. It wasn't just in the UK that he had the impact, it really was worldwide. Both directly and through his students, Fred has reached all over the world. The first of these two tributes comes from Eric Gildentops, who was Inspector General at SWIFT, where Fred became an advisor. Eric invented the COBIT framework with the central control objectives for information and related technology, and led its development until it became a worldwide standard for managing and governing IT. Eric was also executive professor at the Management School of the University of Antwerp, where he initiated the master's program in IT governance, for which Fred was one of the lecturers. Eric.
Thank you, Henry. I tumbled into Fred's world, like many of you, with only a little bit of applied mathematics and computer science in my backpack. I'm saying backpack, not knapsack. Fortunately, when I arrived in your world, Fred was there, because I had lots and lots of questions. I arrived from the financial world, which had, at that time, only thinking and working on profit, balance sheet, and image. However, the image became important when we started moving into the world of secure financial transactions. And even more so, it started involving their wallets when we started automating the archaic manual key management systems. That brought our two worlds together. Fred was my guide in that adventure, but not just me. There's one memory that's burned into my head of Fred that I'd like to share with you. Imagine the boardroom of the Bank of England. In slightly horseshoe-shaped tiered benches sit gentlemen in dark suits, white shirts, dark ties, and in comes this gentleman, not very tall, long flowing hair, jeans, a home-knitted sweater. Nobody reacts. They must know him. And then Fred starts talking, and all these bankers listen enraptured. I wrote here, I'm guessing, but actually after what I heard earlier, I'm not guessing anymore that Fred had a similar impact on the academic world. I miss his guidance, but also I'm missing his dry wit. Like the day when we walked onto the beach at the Belgian coast through a dune reserve that borders the French border. And while walking on the beach, Fred started watching around, and he picked up Marion, and he carried her 50 feet west. Marion said, "Fred, what are you doing?" "Oh, my lady, I'm carrying you into France," he said. So we miss our guide, we miss his dry wit, his brief and to-the-point answers to my clumsy scientific questions, be it the mathematics underlying Sudoku, or, more important, how long would we have to wait for code breaking with quantum computing? Because my CEO had become concerned and asked me to find out how many years we had. So Fred looked into it. I looked at a couple of other sources, and Fred and I concluded, oh, we have about 50 years. That was 30 years ago. And Fred, I think we may still be okay. I'm missing those chats, I'm missing the questions and the answers. Recently, I was considering what he would have thought about something that's been in my mind for a while, and that is the physics and the mathematics about the arrow of time. I'm sure on the mathematics he would say, just multiply by -1. On the physics, we'll never know. On that final note, that question made me think of one of Cher's most important songs. If I could turn back time, And Marion, if I could, I'd bring him back. Thank you.
Our next speaker is Martin Kam, who's commander of the Malaysian Army's Corps Signal Regiment when he was tasked to provide his team with cryptography and cybersecurity training. The result was that Fred spent a lot of time in Malaysia training Martin's team. Unfortunately, Martin is in Malaysia in Kuala Lumpur. He can't be with us today, but he has recorded this message that we'll now play.
Ladies and gentlemen, through my contacts in the UK, it did not take me too long to get on to the hottest item in cybersecurity at that time, the Code and Cyber Brotherhood of Fred and Henry. But it was Fred who came out to Kuala Lumpur to help us train our nucleus of code breakers, as I like to call them. And ever since then, from 1982 onwards, Fred and Marian and the kids have made many visits to Malaysia and have long become our family friend. To me and also many of the Malaysian friends, Fred was not just a distinguished cybersecurity expert, but also a cherished friend, a devoted family man, and an inspiring mentor. In the world of cybersecurity, Fred's influence in Malaysia has been profound. As a mentor, he played a pivotal role in shaping the country's cybersecurity landscape. One of his significant contributions was the establishment of our Cybersecurity Malaysia, which has become the cornerstone in the nation's defense against cyber threats. Fred was always very generous with his time with us. He seemed to have a special liking for Kuala Lumpur. Believe it or not, Fred's impact reached far beyond Malaysia. Through one of his proteges, Fred helped expand cybersecurity to Namibia, establishing degree and postgraduate programs in the Namibia University of Science and Technology. Fred's influence was truly global. I recall many years ago when we were hosting the International Multilateral Partnership Against Cyber Terrorism, or IMPACT, we had Fred out here as an advisor. His expertise was instrumental in fostering international cooperation. Fred's work with IMPACT had been most significant, and his legacy will surely endure for a long time. I would love to share a story of Fred's attendance during the IMPACT session. Our Prime Minister wished to see him one day. Of course, that was not a problem, but I had to persuade Fred to dress up. We had to get him a nice long sleeve batik shirt. And that was another occasion. Our Director General of Intelligence invited him for coffee. I had a small task persuading my friend to change his pinky furry slipper for a pair of shoes. They were really unforgettable moments for me. Now you all know how much I'm going to miss him visiting me in Kuala Lumpur. But Marian did promise that she was going to drop by. Yes, Fred was a loving family man, a devoted husband, a father, and a grandfather. When Marian was not well, Fred called me one day if he could come out with Marian, as she wished to watch elephants bathing in the river. That was his mission statement to me. He took Marian out here, and the four of us, the Pipers and the Cums, two not so young couples, traveled some 500 miles into the wild of Malaysia. Marian did manage to watch the elephants bathing, and if I remember correctly, she even managed to feed one of them. we ended up in the Cameron Highlands, and that was special to him too, because it reminded him of his beloved grandson Cameron. Of course, I shall remember Fred for all his contributions in Malaysia's security world, but most of all, I will never forget him as a loving family man, and it has been a real privilege to call him my family friend. Many thanks, and goodbye, Fred.
Martin's message there reminded me of a story Fred told me one time when he was invited to South Africa to give some lectures, and they wanted to hold a dinner in his honour. And initially it was going to be whites only, which of course Fred said no to. That was absolutely not possible. So eventually they agreed that it would be mixed, that there would be. So in the evening, Fred turns up at the hotel for the dinner, and the doorman refused to let him in because he was inappropriately dressed. And they had to actually send for somebody to come and vouch for him in order to get him into the dinner that was in his honour. Our next tribute is from Ian Standen, who has been the CEO of Bletchley Park Trust for over 12 years and so worked with Fred when Fred was one of the trustees.
Thank you, Henry. Fred served as a trustee of the Bletchley Park Trust between January 2000 and December 2012. He was very dedicated to the role, and his insight and sage advice was highly valued by the Trust. He served at a critical time in the Trust's history. When he arrived on the board, it was struggling to define the direction and purpose, as well as building its finances. He was quick to see the potential of Bletchley Park. He became a great supporter and advocate of the vision to restore the site and to turn it into a fitting tribute for all those who worked there during the Second World War. As his time on the board progressed, the preparatory work necessary to bring that vision to life started to take place, and his input to the process was crucial. As he stepped down from the board, the first and transformational step in that process was underway with funding from the Heritage Lottery Fund. That project was delivered in 2014, and Fred was quite rightly proud of what had been achieved. Now, having completed his time as a trustee, it would be easy and not unreasonable just to step away. But Fred retained an active interest in Bletchley Park and its ongoing development, and continued to be a great ambassador for the Trust. He returned to visit regularly, attending openings and other events laid on for former trustees. As his health started to decline, Marion would bring him up to Bletchley Park for those events. Even when his health prevented him from travelling to Bletchley Park, he continued to maintain his interest. I recall sending him to his home a video copy of one of the update sessions we had laid on for former trustees, so that he could watch it in comfort and keep up with what was going on. My overriding recollections of Fred, and ones which I know are echoed by former CEOs and trustees to whom I have spoken, are of a man whose style was open, friendly, questioning but calm, and who was respected by everybody. He was a very effective trustee whose style was partnership, not confrontation. Fred was one of the good guys, as he was talking about, who made a real difference, a genuine and sincere man, and the Bletchley Park Trust will forever be grateful for his invaluable contribution to helping preserve and restore one of the iconic locations in this nation's history.
Yeah, I know Fred was really very, very proud of what happened with Bletchley Park and how it evolved and developed. So thank you, Ian. Our next tribute comes from Alistair McWilson, who was Global Head of Technology at Accenture and a Senior Government Advisor. He first met Fred in 1989 at a gathering in Washington, D.C., on InfoSec concerns, and they became very solid and close colleagues. Alistair was chairman of the Institute of Information Security, now the Chartered Institute, from 2009 to 2023.
Thank you, Henry. It's such an honour to be here today. But it's also a daunting thing to do. Why? For two reasons. Everybody here knows Fred in some way or another, and so it's hard to find something new to talk about, I guess. But secondly, Fred is a legend in his own right, and you can find information about his successes, the things that he was involved in, so a wealth of such material on the web. It's hard for me to sort of pick up on things new. But there was, from a personal perspective, there were things that were new. My first encounter with Fred was 35 years ago, which isn't long by comparison with some others here. I was actually in Washington, working for the government, but working in Washington on a project. And we had a project that was going rogue, I guess. And so I was asked if I would contact Fred and see whether we could pull Fred into the project as an expert, because his opinion would be valued. So my first contact with Fred was by telephone initially. And in hindsight, telephone with Fred, for somebody who didn't really know, is not a great thing to do. There was lots of quiet expectations on the other end of the telephone. Anyway, I was asking him to come out to the US at incredibly short notice. It was holiday time for him, and in very sensitive circumstances, a joint UK-US project. We badly needed this independent expert review for the joint project, and somebody that could deal with some of the technical issues or think through the way this was being thought through, which was being a bit of a technical and a relationship car crash, frankly. It was one of the US team that suggested Fred was an ideal candidate, so I called Fred. Ironically, I couldn't tell him much about why he should travel to the US, which was an interesting conversation. And a further complication was that at the time, he only knew me from snippets, a background that he gathered from others that I'd met. Nevertheless, he was intrigued enough to be caught on this. Perhaps money might have been a factor. And he decided to make the trip, which was a great relief. Fred arrived, and I have to say, in a room of massive egos, all dressed in suits and uniforms. So he sort of stood out, and there's a theme here, because of his fisherman's jumper, as I call it, and polo shirt. Amazing. He was the only one. He didn't actually get to say very much, but when he did, remarkably, towards the end of the day, he diffused conflicting views. Between the academics and the senior government people, he had such insightful analysis, and to simplify it, he thought that both sides seemed to be ignoring the bigger picture. And he was right. Others have been saying that. And actually, one of his themes developed was about the bigger picture, looking always for the bigger picture, at least when I've seen him present. Anyway, that day he probably saved my career and sanity. Over the following years, Fred and I worked together in a variety of overseas work adventures, I put them. In the US, I took him there, several places. He took me to Asia, Malaysia, Singapore, and various other places, and many, many places in Europe. We sort of became unconventional travel buddies, but he would always sit at the back of the aircraft and not drink the precious champagne, as we heard earlier, but he didn't mind racking up the air miles. So we did some game-changing things, and particularly in InfoSec and crypto. But I think he had a lot of fun doing it. It was completely different to his normal life at university. But Fred could be deviously persuasive, I have to say. I mean, back in 2005, when the ISP was being set up, he quietly engineered my involvement. He sort of lassoed me, I guess, in the formation of the IISP. There were several others, some here, by getting me to review the proposals and key documents for the setup, hoping that would trigger my interest and greater involvement. Well, it did. And as Henry said, it led me to becoming chairman of the Institute and helped us steer the Institute and its board towards Royal Charter, which we achieved a few years ago. I'd say that his netcasting was particularly effective, and in my case captured me in a part-time role there for 13 years. In fact, I should add that during the entire 20-year life of the Institute, Fred did so much to ensure its success. As a founder and board member, Fred advised on direction, he built critical relationships, he attracted key team members and supported our ambitions massively, while quietly keeping out of the limelight himself. I should mention also that Fred was latterly our first honorary fellow, an award so profoundly appropriate for the man, given his outstanding contribution to the profession. So in closing, I have to say that for me, Fred, from my working experiences with him, was a testament to the theory that the quietest people who listen can have the most powerful voices and are often the most influential. More than that, Fred, for me, left an indelible mark for mathematics and InfoSec, but more generally, with his passion to educate, combined with strong intellect and a disarming humility, which all define, I think, what Fred was really about. For me personally, Fred was a remarkable man, a wise and unexpected mentor to me, and a wonderful friend to have. So thank you, Fred. Thank you.
I mean, all the awards and that Fred won, all his achievements are extraordinary. But I know two things really stood out for him at the end. One was the honorary fellowship that he received from the Chartered Institute, and the other one was actually the gold medal that he received from the IMA, the Institute of Mathematics. And those two things, I think, were the most important that in his head that he had received. Our next speaker has also been involved with the Chartered Institute. Steve Furnell is Professor of Cybersecurity at the University of Nottingham and board member of the Chartered Institute, and worked with Fred on a number of projects linked to cyber security education. Please.
Thank you, Henry. So I should probably start by saying that my friendship with Fred is far more recent than a lot of people who've spoken. In fact, I started working with him once he'd, apparently retired. I use the term loosely because he still seemed to be working quite hard. And I must admit, this was something I always admired with Fred. And I think it was clearly a measure of him and of his standing that the profession sector couldn't quite let him go. So, okay, my links with him began properly in 2009, if I remember rightly, when I got involved in a workshop to help form an academic partnership scheme for the Chartered Institute that's been mentioned, so SciSec or IISP as it was then. A few years later, and at Fred's suggestion, I then became a board member of SciSec and actually took on the role that Fred had, being the academic voice within the Institute. However, recognising that even we couldn't quite let him go, we now have a Fred Piper Award, which we annually now bestow upon an outstanding student from our academic partnership programme. So Fred's name living on there to recognise the academic excellence in the next generation. Now, around the same time as this workshop, another joint activity we got involved in was on the board for an information security advisory panel, it was, for Khalifa University in the UAE. Fred had been invited to be on the panel, and he suggested me to chair it, I think probably having realised at that point that I could probably do the report writing part. Now, over the next few years, this involved us taking various night flights over to Dubai, and we were flying Emirates business class. Now, if you've not flown Emirates business class, they've got nice big video screens, and even though you've got a privacy panel that can go up between you, you can still see what the other person's watching. Now, on one of the trips, luckily it wasn't the first one, I decided that I'd watch the film Friends with Benefits with Justin Timberlake and Mila Kunis. Now, if you've not seen it, it's available on Netflix, and I'll leave you to imagine what benefits the friends were sharing. But as we were served breakfast the next day, privacy panel goes down, I've got Fred quizzically looking at me and saying, "Were you watching porn?" And so I was rather more careful with my viewing after that. And having told the story, I bet Fred didn't expect Justin Timberlake to get a mention today, but there you go. So, moving on, probably for the best, our most significant collaboration, I think, began in 2013. We were working with GCHQ and with Chris Ensor to design early versions of the certification program for academic degrees in cybersecurity. We started with general masters in information security and then moved on to more specialised areas and degrees at other levels, so bachelor's and integrated masters. On from that, in 2016, we became advisors for the next phase of GCHQ's activity, which was to establish a body of knowledge as a reference point both for the certification programme and for the wider topic area. And this became the CyBOK project, and Fred and I were involved in assessing the bids for this and then in reviewing the early work through the first few phases of the project, which led on to the first release of CyBOK in, I think it was October 2019. Well, today, CyBOK's become the basis for the degree certifications as a whole. And so the two things that we worked upon have now converged, and they're basically providing a very significant underpinning for cybersecurity education here in the UK and more widely. Now, ironically and rather sadly, I learnt of Fred's passing while attending an NCSC education conference, the content of which actually was based around many of the things that Fred had helped to build and support himself. So for me, it wasn't just the opportunity to work on a series of interesting things, but the opportunity to do so with Fred and for him to actually have invited me to do so. I'm immensely proud to have worked with him, and I'm going to miss the chance to do so again. Thank you very much.
Education was just such a huge part of Fred's life and interest. And again, I keep coming back to the number of lives that that man touched. Extraordinary. Our final tribute this morning is Simon Singh, who's the author of several popular science books, including the Code Book, which is how he came to meet Fred and work with Fred. Thank you, Simon.
Yes, it was, I think, 1997 when I started writing the Code Book, and so obviously I came down to Royal Holloway College. If it was good enough for Sophie Neveu, I figured it was good enough for me. And I met up with Fred, and it was extraordinary. I'm a physicist by training. I knew very little about cryptography, and yet Fred took the time to walk me through the basics of cryptography, to answer my idiot questions, to explain the trickier bits of mathematics to me. It was an incredible privilege to have this kind of this guidance through the incredible world of cryptography. And here was a man with a million things on his plate, a world-famous professor of cryptography, taking the time to coach me through the basics. But that was Fred all over. That was Fred all over. We've heard so many people talking about his dedication to education and sharing information, and because of that, there are now thousands of people around the world in key roles in cybersecurity who trace their roots back to Fred and Royal Holloway College. But it wasn't just the fact that Fred taught me so much about the basics of cryptography. He also introduced me to other people I needed to talk to, and that was crucial. And of course, again, I was an outsider. I didn't come from the world of cryptography or cybersecurity, but if Fred was willing to vouch for me, then people would talk to me. Fred was obviously so respected and so loved and trusted in the community that a nod from Fred was enough for me to then get to talk to these fantastic people who also then helped me understand the world of cryptography. I'll just quickly finish with one story, which my son reminded me of, in fact, just last night, which was when I got married. I moved quite close to where Fred lived, and occasionally we'd bump into each other in the street, and we'd have a chat or grab a coffee. And on one occasion, I was driving along, and I stopped at the traffic lights, and Fred was kind of wandering across the road with his racing post tucked under his arm, of course. And my son was next to me, and I said, "Look, you see this guy here? You don't know him. He looks kind of fairly ordinary, but he's truly extraordinary, truly extraordinary." And somebody used the word legend earlier on. I think that's kind of probably wouldn't have been appropriate at the time as well. And I said, you know what? He's an extraordinary man. He's done incredible things. And he's one of the nicest, kindest, gentlest men you could ever imagine. And if you ever can grow up to be a bit like Fred, that would be a really great thing. And my one regret is actually, I really should have brought my son here today, because hearing all of the wonderful tributes would have helped him understand what I was trying to get at on that afternoon. Thank you very much, Fred.
There are two words there that Simon used that really hit the mark as far as I'm concerned: trust and integrity. That really was Fred. I mean, you could absolutely trust what he said and trust him to do the right thing. Absolutely fabulous. I mean, Fred's legacy is huge, and legend is a good word for it. I mean, the contribution he's made with regard to cybersecurity, both directly and through all his students, is just remarkable. The other thing that has, I hope, come across was one of the things that Fred also pioneered at a time when it wasn't fashionable, was bringing academia and industry together. And he actually coined a phrase which was academia and industry in harmony. And he used to use that phrase a lot. And it really did. It brought those two sort of slightly different worlds, as Eric mentioned. It really did bring them together. And that was just so important for a subject like information security, like cryptography and so on. To finish, we have a piece of music from an artist that Fred adored. In fact, I think most men of my kind of age had a huge crush on Diana Ross. Fred was no exception to this. Again, I think the title of this song says it all. The title is Ain't No Mountain High Enough. And then after the music, after we've had this music, then the family would like to invite everybody to continue sharing memories and so on over some refreshments, which I think are going to be served outside, Chris, if I've got it right. So if you sort of go to the back of the hall and out, you'll find them. And the other thing, as you're on your way out there, Fred died from a terrible, terrible illness, progressive supranuclear palsy, that very little is really understood about and known about. And Marion, Sam, Joanna, they are very, very keen to try and contribute to the understanding of PSP. And so there is a table set up at the back if you want to know more about it, if you'd like to make a donation, whatever. I think as of this morning, there's over £5,000 already been donated in Fred's name. And as I say, I know that would please the family a lot to see that rise.